After an extremely boring day in the middle of the week, my friends and I decided to brighten our mood a bit by going to a cafe. This place was familiar to us because we often met there. It had a certain charm, which was not limited to the modest menu. The worn wooden tables and the faint aroma of roasted coffee mixed with aged whiskey seemed to greet us like old friends. The familiar smiles of the staff and the comfortable rhythm of our conversations made the place feel like it belonged, like it was an extension of our camaraderie. It wasn't that the food was particularly wonderful, rather the opposite. The dishes were simple, prepared, we assumed, by a fairly average chef. But the alcohol selection and secluded seating made this restaurant our favorite place. The dim lighting and quiet music also added to the cozy feeling, making it easy to lose track of time. This is why we never felt the need to change seats. Seated at a table that had long been considered ours, we placed our order and started chatting. The waiters even seemed to know us by now, greeting us with familiar nods and occasional smiles. After an hour, the conversation became more animated as the drinks loosened our tongues and turned up the volume. Stories of childhood pranks, unfortunate blunders at work, and wild adventures spilled over the table. One friend recounted his failed attempt to impress a lover by cooking a gourmet meal that ended in a small kitchen fire. Another shared a story about how he accidentally got locked in his apartment wearing only a towel. Each anecdote elicited new waves of laughter, the kind that made my stomach hurt and my cheeks ache from grinning. One of us, a particularly animated storyteller, would passionately tell some story with exaggerated gestures and expressions. His voice changed dramatically and his hands fluttered as if he were conducting an invisible orchestra. Frankly, none of us were listening anymore. Even the most attentive of us lost the thread of his story within the first few minutes. Sometimes it seemed that even he didn't know what he was talking about. Names and dates were jumbling in my head like a defendant under interrogation. It was nearing midnight, and despite the late hour, I had no desire to leave. My phone buzzed with a ringing tone, but I ignored it. I figured I'd just claim later that I hadn't heard it. After all, I was busy enjoying myself. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the warm camaraderie of the group created a bubble of contentment that I didn't want to burst. Word by word and glass by glass, we continued to chat until a waitress approached our table. I noticed her out of the corner of my eye. She was carrying a heavy tray filled with drinks, and her expression was amusingly focused, as if she were on some great mission. Her steps were cautious but slightly shaky, her lips pressed into a thin line as she stared intently at the tray. Each step seemed measured, her eyebrows slightly furrowed with concentration, as if she was walking on a taut rope. The effort she made to balance the tray, her knuckles turned white as she gripped its edges, was almost comical, made even more so by the faint hesitation in her gait that betrayed her nervousness. In my slightly tipsy state, I found the sight amusing, and I smiled. However, I didn't realize that I was sitting on the very edge of the table, and a slightly staggering waitress is not a good combination. She managed to get to the table without incident, almost. At the very last moment, one of the glasses tipped over, spilling its contents all over me. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, immediately fussing around me and grabbing napkins to wipe the wet fabric of my shirt and pants. There was a note of panic in her voice, and her hands moved quickly, as if trying to repair the aftermath of an accident. "It's okay," I muttered, though I inwardly groaned. Alcohol-soaked clothes weren't the best way to end the night, especially since I had paperwork to do later. The cold dampness clung to my skin, a stark contrast to the warmth of the room. The waitress, whose face was alternating shades of red and pale, quickly ushered me into a spare room in the cafe. She offered to help dry my shirt. Reluctantly, I agreed and pulled the damp fabric off of me. As I unbuttoned my shirt, a wave of indecision swept over me. I felt the awkwardness of the situation and a strange curiosity. What would she think? Would she notice the faint scar on my shoulder, or the uneven tan lines from last summer? My fingers froze for a moment before the fabric slid off my shoulders, leaving me naked. I felt a mixture of vulnerability and defiance, as if daring to look at her or perhaps pretend not to. Her eyes lingered on my naked chest for a moment. Then she quickly averted her gaze, swallowing hard. For a moment there was silence between us, filled only by the distant hum of the cafe's operations. Whether it was the alcohol or something else, I suddenly felt brave. Cutting the small distance between us, I hugged her gently. "Do you want to make it up to her?" I asked softly, my voice low and teasing. She hesitated, but then nodded timidly. My hand slid down her sides and pulled her closer, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. The air between us charged, and in that moment everything else disappeared. Her fingers lightly touched my arms, tentatively at first, then more and more confidently. I could feel the beating of her heart, fast and erratic, as if it were echoing my own. Time seemed to slow down, and the world outside this small room disappeared completely. "I really didn't mean to," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I muttered, interrupting her gently. "It's okay." What had started out as an accident felt like the beginning of something else entirely. The tense atmosphere, the mixture of embarrassment and intrigue, and the closeness of our bodies created an undeniable connection. For a moment I forgot about the spilled drink, the wet clothes, and the persistent odor of alcohol. All that mattered was the electric spark between us and the possibilities it hinted at.